Thanks very much to MJ and Claire for a very comprehensive and in-depth look at some of the governance challenges around large-scale carbon dioxide removal. And I'm welcoming back Claire and MJ, who've amazingly managed to change their clothes since the presentation by the wonders of the internet. They're joining us now live. Good to see some familiar faces in the audience, or familiar names rather. We've got a quite select group today, so that's to your advantage, audience members, in that you've got it's like a seminar. You've got more opportunity to have your question answered by our two experts here. To answer a question, ask a question, don't put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A button just down at the bottom of your screen there, if you're not familiar with it. Hit the button, add the question in, and my colleagues will start feeding those questions through if you have any. And while you're thinking of what question you'd like to ask, and remember, no question is too stupid. This is all about learning. For some of us, this is a very new area of endeavor, and it's very complex. And we have two world experts here on this topic with a lot of experience between them. And so let's make the most of that now. So over to you, audience. Please send your questions in now. And in the meantime, I'd like to, whilst you're thinking what to ask, maybe I'll put a question to MJ and Claire. You've talked about, where to begin? So we've talked about all these governance challenges. Broadly, perhaps pick one of your priority areas, like the incentives or the accounting and monitoring. Can you tell us any more about sort of who should be involved in addressing these governance challenges? So is it within the scope of any existing bodies or current bodies or constellations of institutions internationally? Or do we need new institutions, for example? So I don't know who would like to have a first pop at that one, MJ or Claire?
I can get started, I guess. All right, that's quite a broad question you've asked, I suppose.
Sure.
I think it's pretty clear to me that the climate change regime has many of the aspects that you've described. Maybe they're not as well developed as we would like, and I think we've pointed to some of the challenges in some of our slides. But in terms of reporting greenhouse gas inventories, accounting for emissions and removals, all those systems are set up really under the UNFCCC and under the Paris Agreement. We have a global stock take that is sort of yet to get up and running fully, but that'll also help us track progress toward a balance between emissions and removals. We also have systems that are being developed for, I guess some would see these as a right place for incentives. Others, of course, would express some caution, but Article 6 will be addressing transfers of mitigation outcomes internationally. And I think we'll be having quite a rip-roaring debate as we go forward under what's appropriate for transfer and what really isn't appropriate for transfer. But I think basically the elements that we need for governance broadly in the areas that you've mentioned, they're all sitting there under the climate change regime, sort of waiting to be filled out, I suppose. And other legal frameworks that do exist have basically pointed back to the climate change regime. So I think we're the UNFCCC Paris Agreement is really the core. I don't think we need another body for this.
Thanks. I don't know, Claire, do you want to add anything? Otherwise, actually, this question from one of our audience members sort of elaborates on this rather nicely. Or did you want to come back on that more general question, Claire, or shall I?
I could just make the very brief point
Sure.
that we also have, of course, the IPCC to provide the scientific sort of guidance for parties. So I think that's also a really important part of the puzzle. But yeah, just a very brief point.
Great. So first question from our audience members. Ian, are there sufficient reporting requirements under the Paris Agreement to account for CDR? So MJ, you were implying that perhaps there were, or indeed, should there be an additional agreement of some kind, or perhaps a protocol? Sorry if I misrepresented you there. Do we need an additional agreement or perhaps a protocol to achieve all governance requirements?
Well, I think we have some of the structures in place, but we have massive deficiencies in some of these structures. And I think that's what Ian's pointing to. And I think, if you look back at the 2018 report that we wrote, and as we mentioned, we're in the process of updating that to actually take into consideration some of the recent the recent CMA decisions on transparency and reporting and et cetera. And we've got pages of gaps. So yes, there are big deficiencies. I think that's absolutely safe to say. But if the question is whether there's a, whether we need a different locus for our discussions about CDR governance, whether the climate change regime is the place or whether there should be another place, I would think that the climate change regime is the place to be, elaborating rules and constraints. Claire,
Great,
probably have
thanks.
things to add.
Claire.
Yeah, no, I would agree with MJ. I guess, I mean, if we can't solve some of these problems within the climate change regime, and we already have, these sort of reporting tables for parties to write down what are their emissions, what are their net emissions from each different sector. If we can't add something in there, then I don't really know where we would in an international system. So I guess the focus now really has to be on to try and make these reporting tables as effective as possible, and then also use any independent data sources that we can from the scientific community to help us to verify what governments are telling us. And I think there are still challenges to be overcome there. One of the things I mentioned was this kind of different definitions used for what are anthropogenic emissions and removals from the land sector, different definitions used by modelers versus by the government delegates who are producing greenhouse gas inventories and the IPCC, following the IPCC guidance. So yeah, there are certainly challenges to be filled, but I would agree with MJ that really the Paris Agreement architecture is the place to do that.
Good, very good point. Yeah, good. I particularly like your apple and boot, that slide. I forgot whose it was that puts together, complex equivalents that apples and oranges adding up. So to our audience members, Ian, I hope that answers your question to some extent, and do come back if you want any more detail on that. Any other audience members, add your questions into the Q&A section, and in the meantime, while they're thinking about that, perhaps we could turn to the issue of incentives. Obviously, one side of the governance is to do with regulation, and another side is to do with incentivizing. So how might incentives for CDR deployment at a large scale, if they become necessary, be effectively governed? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll start. Claire, then you please just jump in. I'm laughing only because once you're within the climate change regime, you already have a system. I mean, you have an architecture on finance. You basically have a system in which national governments are putting out their commitments to reduce emissions, and they're putting out there, in the context of longer term strategies, how they plan to move toward consistency with long-term goals. So, I think one big incentive, of course, for parties is trying to actually meet their own commitments. And in terms of the incentives that the system itself can offer, well, clearly there isn't enough finance moving toward no regret strategies, for example, or no regrets options. But there is there are completely insufficient funds within the climate change process, but they do exist. And then we have, as I mentioned, had a discussion around transfers of mitigation outcomes. Of course, that's quite a political discussion. And as I also mentioned, and as we say in the paper, there are quite a few challenges that get thrown up by trying to use Article 6, which is the space for, which is the article that addresses transfers of mitigation outcomes. And there are a few challenges that come from trying to use that space to incentivize, for example, afforestation, reforestation, et cetera, just because of a raft of issues, but impermanence is one obvious one. So there's certainly challenges with using Article 6 for some of the key CDR options. That being said, that there is an accounting structure, and the accounting system can be used to try to create incentives, but even those incentives get challenging when different aspects of the life cycle of emissions happen in different countries, and some of those countries have different capacities. So the clear support that can be had for CDR options are basically direct funding of low cost options, low cost no regret strategies, and then some concerted effort to fund some of the more expensive options. And how that will happen, and whether that happens inside the process or out, I imagine it'll happen outside the process. Claire, please, if you've got thoughts, they're welcome.
Claire? Thanks, Andrew.
My internet's been skipping a little bit, so I hope that I am coming across clearly. Yeah, okay, what to add? Yeah, so I guess there's kind of, well, we could think about two different categories of incentive. There's the incentive to deploy the low-hanging fruits that are already on the ground, and I guess we could draw lessons from, for example, RED+ and other programs that use results-based finance to encourage, well, in the case of RED+, reduced deforestation and forest degradation. So could lessons from that be taken into forest restoration, ecosystem restoration? Yeah, so thinking about all the governance structures that you need within host countries of those projects to make sure that you have the right legal systems in place to make sure that what happens actually happens and remains permanent. But yeah, I think you also then need incentives for scaling up. I think MJ also made this point, particularly with these more novel technological options that we don't yet know how much of them we'll need. It really depends on what we do over the next decade in terms of our emissions reductions, but really a precautionary approach would be to start scaling up these options, or at least doing further research into them. So yeah, I guess you also need somehow to have incentives for doing that. And I guess I think that's, to me, that's still a question, is how are we going to incentivize? Some companies are already doing it. Some companies are already saying we're going to put money into developing, for example, direct air capture. So I guess in a certain way, as MJ said, once you've got the kind of overarching governance of countries and corporate entities, etc., having targets that they need to meet, then that itself is an incentive. But we need to think about how those projects and research initiatives are done in a kind of appropriate fashion and with sustainable development in mind. And I guess one other point I would make there in this perhaps unstructured answer is that we also need to think about the non-carbon benefits of some projects. So in particular, with the land-based options, the more nature-based options, we might not also want to just shoot for optimizing carbon sequestration. You might also want to think about adaptation benefits or biodiversity benefits. And so we don't want to just design an incentive structure that optimizes for one without thinking about the others. I don't have answers for how to do that, but I think it's an important point.
Absolutely, no, that's great. And that brings actually, it's a nice bridge to another question which came from a previous event, actually, on this issue of safeguarding for sustainable development that you raised as in your presentation as well. As we know, there are different forms of carbon dioxide removal and different approaches that are being explored. The IPCC SR 1.5 report tells us a bit about some of the knowledge gaps around those, or some of the potential of some of those, and the governance challenges. But tell us, what are your thoughts a bit more about some of the issues around safeguarding for sustainable development in the governance of these, perhaps picking one or two examples, different examples, and what sort of issues are we talking about here? How do we ensure this alignment when we're talking about scaling up one of these approaches? You mentioned, for example, biodiversity, or one of these, the other SDGs other than climate, which obviously is the first focus.
It's like an infinite question, Nick. That's like, how long is a piece of string? I mean, I'm not sure what, okay, what you're looking for there. But I mean, I guess maybe Claire could almost walk through some of the, sorry about this, Claire, but maybe Claire could almost walk through some of the challenges, if you start talking about BECCS, what does it really mean to be, setting aside land for, biomass that may get used for BECCS? Of course, you have other, does it make sense to be taking down a forest to be, creating an input for combustion, even if you're going to be, ultimately injecting that CO2 into the ground? Does that actually make any sense at all? So, I mean, a lot of different CDR options that are being discussed have really clear trade-offs, as we speak to in our paper, and as Claire has spoken to, and no doubt will encouragement in a few seconds. But you've got competing uses of land. You've got competition for water resources, competition for land resources, competition for space to grow crops. So pretty much any option is going to imply trade-offs that are going to be problematic in different country contexts. And I think that's the challenge, is actually drilling down. You can have a really abstract discussion of CDR options, but when it comes time to actually think about what a given project might look like on the ground, you've got to really think about that in a context specific way. And I think that's the challenge going forward. How to generate some of those research outcomes that give a more clear indication of where some of this is actually possible, and where some of this is actually problematic. And we've got some of the equity concerns that have been raised in some of these sort of recent useful papers that Claire mentioned earlier, and that she's also been an author on. So I'll, sorry, Claire, now toss it over to you.
Thanks, MJ.
Yeah, I guess I think there's been a lot more research into the sustainable development implications of land-based options than for some of the other options. So, for example, direct air capture with direct air capture and storage. There's, I think, slightly less clear evidence on the implications for sustainable development, whereas for things like afforestation and reforestation and BECCS, there's a lot more discussion in the research community about the scales at which these could be deployed and the contexts. And in particular, things like afforestation are very controversial because in many cases it makes more sense to leave intact a natural ecosystem than to change it into a forest plantation, a monoculture plantation, which could reduce biodiversity, increase water use. It could affect local communities adversely, and it could actually not store as much carbon as that initial ecosystem would have. And so, yeah, I mean, everything is very context and scale specific. There's a lot of research looking at bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or bioenergy more generally. I mean, a lot of mitigation pathways, actually, most mitigation pathways use a lot of bioenergy, regardless of whether they use BECCS to subsequently put the carbon underground. And that obviously raises a lot of issues for land demand, for food security, for biodiversity and local livelihoods. But I'd say there's been more research done at the kind of the worst case scenario, or the let's consider what a lot of models say is the amount of BECCS that we might use, which is obviously going to lead to very bad outcomes potentially. And there's maybe less research done in the local contexts where bioenergy could actually have benefits. For example, if it's done in a, if you have an agricultural system where you have intercropping of bioenergy crops with other crops, or temporary fallow, where you change land temporarily to grow bioenergy crops, or where you use crop residues. In some contexts, it could provide a local source of income, a local source of energy generation. And so there are two sides to the coin, really. And then if we go to things like soil carbon sequestration, biochar, there are potential benefits for food security, for the soil quality. But then at the same time, a lot of these nature-based options we know become more vulnerable with increasing land use change and increasing climate change impacts. So that's another thing that we'll have to consider is, are these ecosystems that we're relying on to store more carbon, are they going to be so vulnerable if we sort of don't reduce emissions in time that they're going to re-release a lot of that carbon and then lead to even more warming? And I guess this is where the point of making sure that you're also, if you're doing ecosystem-based CDR, that you also need to think about the resilience of these ecosystems and what other ecosystem services they're providing. Yeah, and then I would say that more research needs to be done into sort of maybe more innovative carbon removal options to understand their sustainable development impacts. And I guess all of this points to the need for really multi-level governance. So including, going from the national, international level all the way down to the local level, to make sure that all stakeholders are having a say in what impacts any project is having on their development.
Very good, excellent, thank you. So audience members, last chance to ask a question. Any more clarifications you want on what MJ and Claire have told us? Now's your chance, otherwise we can wrap up. And whilst you're having final thought, just to highlight MJ and Claire, I think, have both alluded to the paper that they were lead authors on for C2G back in 2018. I mentioned at the start, and that's going to be updated and published again soon. You can find the existing version on our website, and also another host of new papers coming out shortly around these issues, the interaction between the Sustainable Development Goals and carbon dioxide removal, biodiversity threats and carbon dioxide removal. So look to C2G's website for more information on that. And of course, visit the C2GLearn website for more information on upcoming events. That's at www.c2g2.net/C2GLearn. And if there are no more questions, then I think we can wrap up for now. So it leaves me with just to say, after we close, there'll be a survey pops up, and by all means, we welcome your comments on this event and any of the other events. And also, if you have a follow-up question you thought of there, then throw it into the survey, and we'll try to pick that one up too. And do sign up for updates for forthcoming events in future. And that remains just to thank our speakers for today, MJ and Claire, for their great, succinct presentations and responding to those questions, and to the C2G team in the background, and of course to you, our participants. So look out for the updated paper, and take care, and we'll see you again next time.